In 1988, Uzbekistan was the largest exporter of cotton in the entire world. The Soviet Union had pulled off one of the most ambitious agricultural projects in human history, turning a barren desert into a global commodity powerhouse. By every official metric, it worked. But there was a price, and the price was a sea. A sea the size of Ireland that had existed for 11,000 years, gone in 40. You probably haven't heard much about the Aral Sea. Most people haven't. But the dust from its dead floor has been found in the blood of penguins in Antarctica. Its toxic particles have shown up in the lungs of people in Norway. The cancer rate in the surrounding region is 25 times the world average, and the children born there, the ones who survive, enter a world where infant mortality rivals sub-Saharan Africa. This is not a chapter from Soviet history. The consequences are still spreading right now, and the worst is still ahead. The story you've probably heard goes something like this. The Soviet Union diverted some rivers to grow cotton, the Aral Sea dried up. Tragic, historic, done. There are photographs of rusting ships stranded in the desert. The images went viral. People called them haunting, and then moved on. The world filed it under things the Soviets did wrong and left it there. But that framing misses almost everything. It misses why the decision was made in the first place. It misses the ideology that made it not just possible, but inevitable. And it completely ignores what is coming next. A regional conflict over water, 5 nations, 75 million people, and no power positioned to stop it. So here is the question nobody is asking. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Cotton Project officially ended. The political system that engineered this disaster no longer exists. So why is it still getting worse? Why are the glaciers feeding the last remaining rivers melting 12 times faster than they were in the 1960s? Why are children in Uzbekistan still being pulled out of school every September to pick cotton by hand? And why are the borders drawn by Joseph Stalin, borders deliberately designed to guarantee future conflict, about to become the fault lines of the next major regional war? The Aral Sea didn't just die, it set a trap, and Central Asia is still walking into it. The Aral Sea was not supposed to exist. Geologically, it was an accident. Around 12,000 years ago, a river changed course and slowly filled a depression on the border of what is now Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. What formed was a body of freshwater, roughly 68,000 square kilometers, that became the 4th largest lake on Earth. It sat in the middle of one of the most inhospitable landscapes on the planet, surrounded by desert nearly 1,500 kilometers from the nearest ocean. Its entire existence depended on a precise balance. 80% of its water came not from rainfall, but from 2 rivers. The Amu Darya, flowing down from the Pamir Mountains, and the Sir Darya from the Tian Shan. Evaporation out, river inflow in. Equal, stable, for centuries. The equilibrium held. There was one warning. In the medieval period, something disrupted one of those rivers. The sea began to dry. By 1417, a court historian wrote that it no longer existed. Then the rivers corrected, and by 1570, the sea had returned to full size. A warning written directly into history that this lake's survival depended entirely on those 2 rivers remaining untouched. That warning was eventually found, read, and then ignored. By the mid-1800s, the Russian Empire had absorbed Central Asia. A Russian climatologist named Alexander Voykov surveyed the region and reached a conclusion that would shape the next century of decisions. The Aral Sea, he wrote, was a useless evaporator, a mistake of nature. He died in 1916 with the sea still full. But his ideas did not die with him. In 1948, Joseph Stalin launched what the Communist Party called the Great Plan for the Transformation of Nature. The premise was explicit. Nature was not a fixed condition, it was an obstacle. And obstacles, under the correct application of Soviet will, could be engineered out of existence. The 2 rivers feeding the Aral Sea would be redirected. The surrounding desert would become farmland. Central Asia would produce cotton, white gold, and the Soviet Union would supply itself and sell the surplus to the world. This was not done in ignorance. Soviet scientists formally flagged the consequences in 1964 and again in 1968. They knew the sea would shrink. The Ministry of Water knew, the party knew. They decided it didn't matter, because Voikov had already told them it was useless anyway. Here is the structural mechanism that most coverage gets wrong. The ideology, the belief that human systems can override natural ones, did not die when Stalin did. Khrushchev expanded the project. Then, in 1973, Egypt lost the Yom Kippur War, switched Cold War allegiances, and cut off its cotton exports to the Soviet Union entirely. Moscow's response was not to reconsider. It was to double down. Dig more canals, divert more water, make Central Asia fill the gap. By 1988, it worked, on paper. Uzbekistan was the world's largest cotton exporter, but the system had made itself irreplaceable. The governments that inherited it after 1991 couldn't stop, even if they wanted to. Cotton was the economy. Stopping cotton meant fiscal collapse. So to this day, Uzbekistan mobilizes 2 million workers every September for the harvest, including, by credible estimates, close to 500,000 who participate under compulsion. Many are school children, required to pick 20 to 60 kilograms per day, sleeping in farm sheds with no bathrooms and no kitchens. The Soviet project ended. The Soviet logic never did. In 1960, the Aral Sea covered 68,000 square kilometers. The two rivers discharged 14 cubic miles of water into the basin every year. By the mid-1970s, that figure had fallen to 7. By the end of the 1980s, after the Soviet canal expansion triggered by Egypt's cotton embargo, it had dropped to less than 1 cubic mile, less than 7% of what the sea required to survive. The math was merciless. By 1987, the sea split into 2 separate bodies. By 1998, salinity had reached 376 grams per liter, more than 10 times saltier than the ocean comparable to the Dead Sea. The fish were gone by 1992. The industry that had employed 40,000 people and supplied a sixth of the Soviet Union's total fish catch ceased to exist. Port towns that had sat on the coastline for centuries found themselves 100 kilometers from the nearest water. What replaced the sea was the Aralkum Desert, and the Aralkum is not simply empty land. The exposed floor is saturated with decades of agricultural runoff, pesticides, fertilizers, industrial chemicals, all crystallized on the surface as the water evaporated. Winds launched this material into dust storms visible from space, stretching up to 300 kilometers wide. During summer months, up to 40% of those storms by volume is pure salt. Then there is the island. In the Soviet era, a remote island at the center of the sea, Vozrozhdeniya, was chosen as the site of a classified biological weapons facility. Its isolation was the security system. The water was the containment. Scientists tested anthrax, smallpox, bubonic plague, and other agents there for decades. In 1971, a smallpox release infected residents of the nearest town. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the scientists evacuated and left everything behind. By 2001, the island had become a peninsula as the sea retreated. By now, it is part of the desert floor. In 2002, the United States intervened to decontaminate 10 anthrax burial sites on the former island. What else remains in the dust is not fully accounted for. The surrounding region reflects all of it. Cancer rates run 25 times the global average. Toxic pesticide residues have been found in the breast milk of local mothers. The dust does not stay local. Aral particles have been detected in Norway, in Greenland, and in the bloodstream of penguins in Antarctica. Here is where history becomes forecast. The glaciers in the Tian Shan and Pamir Mountains, the same mountains that supply the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, are now melting at a rate 12 times faster than before the 1960s. The dust storms coating them are accelerating the melt. Less snowfall is replacing what is lost. The rivers are contracting, and 75 million people depend on those rivers. In 1960, Central Asia had 24 million. The population has tripled. The water has not. 2 pressure points are already building. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan generate more than 90% of their electricity from hydroelectric dams on these rivers. As flows decline, both governments will be incentivized to build more dams and retain more water upstream. Every cubic meter they hold back is a cubic meter that does not reach Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan. And for those downstream governments, that is not an inconvenience. It is an existential threat. Without irrigation, their cotton industries collapse. Without cotton, their governments face insolvency. The second pressure point is demographic. Uzbekistan's population has grown fourfold since 1960. There are now more ethnic Uzbeks in Central Asia than all other groups combined. Stalin's border design left hundreds of thousands of them scattered inside Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, including, in Turkmenistan's case, communities located almost directly adjacent to the canal that diverts the Amudarya away from Uzbekistan. The pretext of ethnic reunification is already available. Russia, which might once have stabilized the region through its military alliance, refused to defend Armenia when Azerbaijan attacked it in 2022. It will not deploy to Central Asia while it is absorbing casualties in Ukraine. China remains the only actor with regional capacity, and its attention is elsewhere. Here is the reframe. This was never an environmental disaster. Those photographs of rusting ships stranded in the sand were never really about the environment. They were evidence of something else. What happens when an ideology decides that the natural world is simply a variable to be optimized? The Soviet Union is gone. The cotton fields remain. The forced labor remains. The artificially fractured borders remain. The glacier melt set in motion by a decision made in Moscow in 1948 cannot be reversed. The tragedy is not that the sea dried up. The tragedy is that every single mechanism that caused it is still operating. The dust from the Aral Sea floor has crossed every border on Earth. The water wars now forming in Central Asia will produce displacement, failed states, and a regional vacuum that no major power is currently positioned to fill. This is not a distant problem contained by geography. The last empire that decided Central Asia was too remote to matter is the reason this conversation is happening. The question is not whether this gets worse. The question is whether anyone is paying attention before it does. And if you think they are, I'd look again.